To do right now, bring into the conversation our friend, legal analyst Nicole DeBoard. She's been following this alongside us, and she joins me. Nicole, thanks for being with us here, and good to see you. We await the departure there of Baldwin and his team. So just want to let you know I might have to interrupt just so we catch that while I pepper you with questions about the highlights of today. Before we get into it, though, we just want to let our viewers watch yet again the brief opening statements, first from the prosecution. Let's watch this.
The fatal and one of the main problems that afternoon of October 21st was that the defendant didn't do a gun safety check with that inexperienced armorer. He pointed the gun at another human being, cocked the hammer, and pulled that trigger in reckless disregard for Ms. Hutchins' safety.
So, Nicole, I want to get into with you the fact that the prosecution is going hard on gun safety, gun practices. We'll get into that in just a moment here. Here we have it. Let's watch.
There's the TLC crew. There we are. Ein Songfight.
How come this trial changed away guns over the concept?
He's under very strict orders.
All right, you see there Alec Baldwin's brother as well getting into that vehicle. Alec Baldwin not taking any questions. I don't believe many questions were thrown at him or shouted at him. I didn't hear any, but we have Nicole DeBoard on the line, and she's going to answer the questions I shouted at her. Nicole, thanks for being with us here. Not much out of that departure there, but we don't want to miss in the event that Baldwin does take the opportunity. We know he is, very outspoken, especially on the streets of New York when people find him and get him to comment on some of these things there, and some of them have gone viral. Not this case, though. Is that at the order and direction of his attorneys, do you think?
Well, it certainly should be. The best place to get to justice is in the courtroom. And so anything that happens outside the courtroom, you hope, doesn't come into the view or into the consideration of the jurors in the case. So his lawyers would certainly want to make sure that any comments that he has, if he ever does decide to testify, would be made in front of the jury, where rules of evidence would tailor what would be allowed in terms of questioning and what would not.
Yeah, and we also, like we promised, have some of the opening statements from the defense as well that we want to play out for our viewers. Let's watch that.
This was an unspeakable tragedy, but Alec Baldwin committed no crime. He was an actor acting, playing the role of Harlan Rust. An actor playing a character can act in ways that are lethal, that just aren't lethal on a movie set. On this movie set, there were people responsible for ensuring the safety of the set and the firearm. Those people failed in their duties, but Alec Baldwin committed no crime. The most critical issue in this case is how a real bullet got on a movie set. The evidence will show that real bullets are never supposed to be on movie sets. On this set, there was a real bullet, something that should never be on a movie set, something which has nothing to do with making a movie. And you will hear no evidence, not one word, that Alec Baldwin had anything to do with that real bullet being brought onto that set.
So, Nicole, and I think our viewers know this, that question has already been adjudicated in the very same courtroom about how a live round got onto the movie set in the armorer Hannah Gutierrez we read. Wasn't that question already answered in that trial? And if so, do they have to bring it up in this trial? Do they have to prove the same thing?
I think that they do. And I think that this is the toughest job for the prosecution in terms of hurdles that they're going to have to get over, because in this trial, they're trying to put the responsibility for recklessness, of course, squarely on Baldwin. But the reality is that they've already had a trial where questions about how live ammunition actually made it onto the set. And had that not happened, we would not be in this trial at all, because there would have been no death. And that, quite frankly, is going to be the biggest hurdle, I think, for the prosecution in this case.
We brought on some legal analysts earlier in the week who had described to us this major victory for the Baldwin defense, the fact that the prosecution cannot even mention that he was a producer on the film Rust. And you heard there in Alex Spiro's opening, he's just an actor. How can you expect an actor to know gun safety, gun protocol? He's just acting. Is that going to go well with the jury, do you think?
That's such a tough question. And he comes into this trial with people having feelings that are very strong potentially about him as a person. There will be some jurors who just don't like him because they've heard of him and have an opinion about him. There will be some who do. Obviously, during jury selection, anybody who had such a strong opinion that they could not fairly listen to the evidence should have been screened out. But at the same time, there will still be people who are familiar with him and have an opinion about him in general. And when you add to that the idea that the jurors have to weigh the issues of gun responsibility, gun safety against the actual criminal rules that have to be considered in this case, there is a lot to think about in terms of how this evidence plays out and ultimately whether the prosecution can make this case.
But the burden now that the producer aspect of it has been eliminated and he's just the actor, Alec Baldwin, that seems to have lowered the burden on the defense.
Well, this defense has no burden. Keep in mind that the only side of the case that has a burden in a criminal prosecution is the prosecution. They entirely are the ones responsible for either making the case or not. And they're the ones that have to bring the evidence. And if they don't bring it, then the answer is just simply not guilty.
Okay.
That said, there are going to be, as you pointed out earlier, questions in the jurors' minds that really ought to be addressed by the defense's presentation of their own case, even though they're not obligated to present one, about whether or not he was being reckless and whether or not the prosecution has met their burden.
I see. What about the witnesses here? We know a police officer who responded to the scene was called up, the crime scene technician as well. There was a lot of technical language about firearms and protocol on movie sets with regard to firearms here. So it was quite technical. Did you glean anything of substance today from the witness testimony that will matter going forward?
I did, and I think that the reality is that you're going to have the same questions that we've been discussing all along, and as this trial has been really approaching, it's the same question: whether or not people believe that it was so reckless as to, disregard what would normally be safety protocols with firearms that it rises to the level of criminal responsibility. Also, there's this issue with being an actor, being handed a weapon and being told it's a cold gun, because in that circumstance, not only should there not be a live round in the weapon, but there shouldn't be any round potentially in the weapon. And I think that we can expect to hear more detailed testimony about that. And if that is the case, and the person who is wielding the weapon is told that it is effectively not something that can be fired or can injure someone, then it is going to be really difficult for the prosecution to attribute any kind of criminal responsibility to the person wielding it.
I think it's always so interesting, aside from the legal nitty-gritty, just to watch the body language, the posture, kind of the facial expressions of the defendant, and it is such a high-profile defendant. I mean, Alec Baldwin is, arguably one of, the most famous American actors of his generation. And I was struck by the fact, very calm, very sedate, somewhat slouch in his posture. Were you looking at that too?
I was, and he is very, carefully taking notes and being, studious in appearance, making it appears caution. He's being cautious not to make facial expressions. And these are all things that were I his lawyer, I would also want him to do. Really, if you are going to be in trial as the accused, you want to do everything that you can to make sure that you're not through your own body language testifying before a decision is ever made to take the stand. So he's doing exactly what he should be doing.
When you talk about body language, does that translate into eventually, if he does take the stand, and I don't want to get ahead of ourselves here, that's up to the defense, I believe, here. But if he does take the stand, will that question of remorse be front and center? Will he have to display that in some capacity? And if not, would that be detrimental to their case?
Another great question. I mean, the reality is that it is not an element, right? It's not something essentially that negates something the prosecution has to prove one way or the other, whether an individual has remorse. On the other hand, the jurors who would ultimately weigh the credibility of the witness testifying are going to want to see human qualities in that person to make, in my opinion, a judgment call as to whether or not they believe the words coming out of his mouth. But as you know, having watched many, many criminal trials and reported on them, sometimes a decision is made not to testify simply because either the prosecution hasn't put on enough evidence to bring a case forward, or for other reasons, it may be the right legal call to simply not do that.
Nicole, I've been asking so many of our legal analysts that have come on, including yourself here, how much is this going to be a carbon copy of the trial of Hannah Gutierrez Reed? Are there stark differences that you've already seen today where they're going to be radically different?
I think that there are, because really what we have from the defense is what sometimes is called the empty chair defense, because in this trial, you don't have the armorer sitting there in the courtroom as an accused. You instead have the person who was given the gun, was told that it was not something that could be fired, did not have a projectile in it. And the person who the defense is saying is really to blame is not going to be present in this particular case to be accused or to be convicted by this jury. So I think that is going to make for a very different presentation of evidence by the prosecution and a different set of cross-examination questions by the defense.
Yeah. All right, Nicole DeBoard, we're going to have to leave it at that. I think we're going to be relying on your expertise a lot throughout the duration of this, and we're not expecting it to go on for very long, barring any unforeseen, errors or delays or disruptions. Nicole, thanks so much.
Thanks for having me.
All right.